I'm going to briefly start this over. You'll hear my spiel again. Okay, so this week we're going to talk about the blood vessels and systemic circulation. Systemic meaning the blood flow through the entire human organism. Last week we talked about how the heart is the pump that provides the force that causes the blood to circulate, and the blood vessels are the pipes that carry the blood to the body tissues and back to the heart. The blood vessels participate in regulating blood pressure and directing blood flow to the body's most active tissues, things that perform metabolic activities, like our visceral organs, your liver, digestive tract, all that kind of stuff. So blood pressure has to be high enough to cause blood flow sufficient to meet the tissue's metabolic needs. And when I say metabolic, I mean the energy to perform their function. So blood vessels are organized into two sets. The first is pulmonary vessels, and that's what transports the blood from the right ventricle through the lungs, where it is oxygenated, it's gas exchange, and our lungs, we breathe out the carbon dioxide. So oxygen is put back in the blood, and then the pulmonary vessels return them back to the left atrium. Systemic vessels transport the blood from left ventricle through all the parts of the body and back to right atrium. And the heart provides the force that causes the blood to move through these vessels. We're also going to talk about the different linings within the blood vessel, and you'll see that there's smooth muscle within the blood vessels that can also contract and dilate, which also help regulate blood pressure. So this is what we talked about last week. The oxygenated blood returns to the right atrium via the superior vena cava. It goes through the tricuspid valve. And does anyone remember why valves are there? Yes, to prevent backflow. Correct. It goes to the right ventricle, and then it goes to the pulmonary valve. And we can remember this because it has to go to the pulmonary valve, go through the pulmonary vessels to hit the lungs, and then the pulmonary vessels bring it back to the left atrium. It is now oxygenated. It goes through the bicuspid or the mitral valve. Those are both names for it. This mitral, I believe, is a name for like a bishop's hat, and that's what the bicuspid valve looks like. So some people call it that. And then it lands in the left ventricle, where it will leave to travel the body. So what are the functions of the circulatory system? Let me silence this. It's my mom sending me my great grandma's like recipe. Grandma Billy. Okay, sorry. Really good at 8 in the morning. Your mom. Okay. Functions of the circulatory system is it carries the blood to the body's tissues. The circulatory system exchanges nutrients, waste products, and gases with the tissues, because as it flows, it's slowly becoming deoxygenated because it's giving its oxygen, taking in the wastes from the tissues. The circulatory system also, as we've learned, transports substances like hormones. It also, we'll learn whenever we cover the lymphatic system, that it also carries immune system components and molecules required for metabolic processes, molecules such as enzymes and catalysts that help start the body process. It helps regulate blood pressure, and it directs the blood flow to the tissues. I got you a lot of visual aids. So if you use my PowerPoints to study, this is just another picture showing heart circulation. But you can really see the actual vessels, and I thought that was great. So let's talk about the structural features of blood vessels. Blood vessels are hollow tubes that conduct blood through the tissues of the body. So these form a continuous passageway for blood flow, and there's 3 main types. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. Capillaries are the middle point in between arteries and veins that joins them together. And they're the most common blood vessel type. We have like billions of capillaries in our bodies. They're the thinnest of all blood vessels, and that comes into play with embalming because we use preservatives that act on body proteins. So it has to reach the capillaries and the tissue spaces in order for the preservative to work. Veins always carry blood to the heart. So arteries are away, veins are towards. This is everybody good? Press switch. Okay. This is just a visual representation of how arteries and veins are joined. You can see that there's these capillary beds, and they're very thin. And so you have your artery on one side. It will get smaller and smaller until it becomes an arteriole, and then it goes through the capillary bed, and eventually turns into a venule, which turns into the vein. So the arteries and veins that work together are always beside each other, and these capillaries help exchange things in between them. So let's talk about capillaries.
That's like when you raise the artery, you grab that vein sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. And they're inside that carotid sheath. So it'll have the artery, the vein, and the nerve. A lot of times the nerve run right beside them as well. So capillaries. All blood vessels have an internal lining of simple squamous epithelial cells. Y'all remember what that means? One layer of flat or regular shaped cells. And that is so, the reason that they're flat and irregular is so things can diffuse through them more easily. Capillaries form the connection between arteries and veins, and they function primarily to carry oxygen and nutrients to the actual body cells. The capillaries is where the exchange of gases, nutrients, and waste in the blood and tissues occur. There's approximately 40 billion capillaries in the human body. I forgot to fact check that. That is what your textbook said, so I'm assuming it's true. I was like, well, okay. Capillaries are so small that red blood cells have to flow single file through them. That's how tiny they are. And so you'll see that the capillary, you can see it going from oxygenated to deoxygenated. The artery is going in a different direction than the vein because it's going to, and the veins bringing it back. The lymphatic vessels are kind of intertwined in this. We'll see that in a couple weeks when we talk about the lymphatic system. And so you can see the individual body cells. It's very tiny. There are three primary types of capillaries. I'm not going to test you on these unless they are in your tag, but I don't believe they are. But just to give you a deeper understanding so you can grasp it better. Three types of capillaries: continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoidal. So there's also another special type of capillary that helps maintain the blood-brain barrier. Now remember the blood-brain barrier and how it keeps certain things from going inside to reach the brain and it like things out. And certain things can cross and certain things can't. So we have continuous capillaries that have no perforations. They're only found in skin, muscle, fat, and nervous tissue. Fenestrated have small pores, and those are found in the intestines, kidneys, and endocrine glands. And sinusoidal have large open pores, and those are in bone marrow, lymph nodes, and spleen. So you can see how the continuous ones, no perforation. So that one's going to have less molecules coming in and out of them. The one for the kidneys and the endocrine glands and the intestine, we're going to have a lot more exchange going on. So they have these pores where things flow through them. And sinusoidal, we talk about sinuses. It's basically like drains blood. So these have large open pores. Capillary network. Capillaries form extensive networks so that every body cell is near a capillary carrying blood. Individual capillaries are part of that capillary bed, and it's just an interweaving network so that everything can reach those body cells. Because as you've seen, if you see an embalming, these are just vessels. So you have to think about how is that blood, how is that oxygen reaching the actual body cells when they're just in these little like pipes around the body. It's these capillaries. So the more metabolically active, the more capillaries are needed. So you can experiment and you can press your fingernail. It turns white, it blanches, and then it refills. So that's like you can witness like a capillary bed right there. And that's also how we check to see if there's distribution during embalming. You always look at those fingernails, see if they're and that's like a sign of like, we use dye tracers where we put cosmetic dyes in so we can trace how it's flowing through the body and where it's reaching and where it's not reaching. So if it's reaching the fingernail beds, you're doing good. Any questions so far? Another picture. Just because I think it's easier if you see it to kind of picture it in your head. Okay, so that's your capillaries. Very important to the embalming process. So let's talk about the structure of arteries and veins now. So blood vessel walls have 3 different layers or tunics. The first is the tunica intima, which means it's the innermost layer. And it's composed of endothelium, which is a specialized cell inside, or specialized lining inside the blood vessels. It has a basement membrane. It has a layer of connective tissue called the lamina propria, and a fenestrated layer, meaning there's tiny pores of elastic fibers called the internal elastic membrane. So that's what you can feel when you're embalming that. Especially with the carotid, that's an elastic artery. It feels like a giant rubber band. And you can feel that if you rub it between your fingers. You have the middle layer, which is tunica media, and that's your smooth muscle arranged around the blood vessel. It can constrict and dilate to help control blood pressure going to certain parts of the body. And it also has an elastic membrane that separates it from the tunica adventitia. So I had a student tell me, it was like, every time I try to shoot up, meaning not drug, meaning embalming, when you direct the flow to the head, sometimes there's like this inner tube inside the blood vessel that can get pushed up, and it will end up blocking the flow, and you can't get arterial fluid to it. So you can actually go in with hemostats and pull that layer down. So you'll see that every once in a while. I never had it happen to me until I saw it happen to someone the other day when I was watching their case. So it will happen. There's like an inner tube in the so that's the tunica media. The tunica adventitia is the outermost layer. That's what we see visually, and it's composed of connective tissue. And the transition from one vessel type, meaning the artery, to the capillary to the vein, is very gradual. This is an example. So you've got your thin outer layer. You've got the inner layer of the muscle and elastin that can actually break away because it's separated. And then the endothelium is the very inside of the vessel. And then the wide central lumen, that just means the actual tunnel going through. We're going to talk about arteries first. There's 3 different types of arteries. You have elastic arteries, which are your largest arteries. They are called conducting arteries because they're the first arteries to receive blood from the heart. So the blood pressure is relatively high in these. The biggest examples would be the common carotids. They're right there receiving that first blood. We also have muscular arteries, and that's as you're going to the extremities. So they're getting further and further away from the heart, so they're getting a little bit smaller. So these are your medium to small arteries. They're thick. They're called distributing arteries because they're distributing from the main trunk of the body to the extremities. And so the smooth muscles in these, because they're muscular arteries, they help regulate blood supply and blood pressure to different regions of the body. And then you have smallest arterioles, smallest vessels, which are called arterioles, which transport the blood from the small arteries to the capillaries, where they then become veins. Any questions on arteries so far?
Say that, arterial, they transport blood to the capillary.
Yes, yes, because they're the smallest. The capillaries, then that reaches the actual body cells. Then we have veins. So with arteries, we started from largest to smallest. We reached the capillaries. So now we're going to go smallest to largest. So it starts with the venules, which are the smallest veins that collect blood from the capillaries and then transport them to small veins. From the small veins, we go to the medium and large veins, which collect blood from the small veins and deliver to the large veins. And these are the ones that transport the blood back to the heart. We also have portal veins. There's only 2 in the human body. So portal veins are a capillary network directly connected to another capillary network by portal veins. So you have hepatic portal veins, hepatic meaning liver, that carry the blood from the capillaries in the GI tract to the spleen to dilated capillaries called sinusoids. And I know that sounds really confusing, but when I say portal, just kind of picture things draining. So because there's only 2, you have one in the liver, and that's carrying blood from the capillaries to the digestive tract and the spleen through sinusoids, meaning there's large pores in them. Then you have the second one in the head, and it's called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal. Anybody else want to try to pronounce that? So you've got hypothalamus and hypophysis. So pituitary and hypothalamus. So the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal vein that carries blood from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland at the base of the brain. So it kind of just drains everything. Good so far? Veins have valves, and we also have something called a vasa vasorum. So veins that have diameters greater than 2 millimeters have valves, which prevents backflow. So it directs the blood through the vein towards the heart. It's not allowed to come back. For arteries and veins greater than 1 millimeter in diameter, y'all know what diameter? A whole circle all around, or across the circle, sorry. Okay, so if it's greater than 1 millimeter for arteries and veins, nutrients are supplied to the actual blood vessel walls by smaller blood vessels called vasa vasorum. I've got you some pictures.
Fire alarm.
So here's what these vasa vasorum look like. Here's the lumen, which is the inner vessel, the inside of the blood vessel. They'll branch off to give oxygen and nutrients and blood to actual blood vessel walls. So you can just kind of see that. Here's the artery and the vein. In between these is going to be a capillary. They're just so tiny. This is an example of what the valves look like. So if blood's going this way, if it tries to backflow and hit those valves, it closes it. And that can actually be a problem. But they're there for a reason. So when we get to pathology, we're going to talk about diseases, disorders, illnesses of the circulatory system. So the veins of the lower limbs are subject to certain disorders just because, like, people who are ill, especially people who have other diseases or disorders like diabetes, it's harder for blood flow to get to the lower limbs. So a lot of the times you'll have certain disorders come up, such as varicose veins, which is when the veins are stretched. They'll actually twist, but the veins are stretched to the point that the valves are incompetent and can no longer prevent backflow of the blood. So as a result, you've got this great blood pressure in the veins that's greater in the lower limbs. So it'll result in edema and swelling and moisture buildup, which can also result in phlebitis. Phlebitis is when blood flow in the veins becomes stagnant and the blood starts to clump in them. And phlebitis is the name for inflammation of the veins. Well, phlebitis can lead to gangrene. Has anybody seen gangrene before? I saw it in a crime lab once, and you don't want that. Gangrene is tissue death. So it's when inflammation is so severe and blood flow becomes stagnant, that gangrene, basically it's just necrosis. And usually the feet get it, the feet and maybe like the lower leg. Do you want to see what it looks like? Yeah. See, I used to like really put all the pictures of my disorders, and I have one of them out on me, but I'm like, you're an embalmer, you're going to see this. So this is actually what gangrene can look like. That's tissue death. That is very dangerous. Yup. So I've seen that before. You need to cover that with a colorant, wrap it up. Don't touch it.
Don't touch it.
Huh?
Don't touch it.
You will see it. And because people with like diabetes are more prone to this because of the loss of the lack of blood flow to their feet. So that's a lot of times diabetics have to have their feet amputated. Like that's an actual problem. Yeah.
Doors will get like that.
Mm-hmm. So that's gangrene. Look at varicose veins, which you can get if you stand in place for really long periods of time all your life.
I used to think I was going to be varicose veins because I never sit down. I stand up right.
I know, and I used to work all my jobs were standing, like waitress, like funeral director, everything I've ever done. I'm like on my feet all day.
I got a cousin who got him really bad.
Oh, God. And it looked painful. Like they actually twist like this. And eventually it'll get to the point where they look like they're like flat and they look like this. So it's very common. It's not as dangerous as like, I mean, it can lead to phlebitis, but that is a common thing that people live with. Look at that. My soul would leave my body if my leg looked like that. Just saying. Okay. So that's my gross you out for the day. So how does the nervous system come into play with the blood system? The autonomic nervous system, remember that? It's responsible for the involuntary control of visceral organs, including the heart and the blood vessels. So the nervous system does work hand in hand with the blood circulatory system as well as the endocrine system. And as we age, our arteries will have these problems. I mean, not everybody, but generally, this is a common thing. You have arteriosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries. Here's your fun embalming fact for the day. The common carotids are almost never sclerotic. So if you pull up a common carotid artery and it's hard as a rock, chances are the entire body is going to be that way, because those are going to be the last vessels that get it, because they're leaving the heart. They have they have the highest blood pressure. So you'll almost never see it in the common carotids. And if you do, be prepared for a 4-hour embalming process.
Mhm.
You'll also see atherosclerosis, which is the crunchy plaque deposits in the wall of the arteries. I say crunchy, like pulled up and like done that. But if you have, you know. So arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. Atherosclerosis is plaque deposits in the walls of the arteries. And I'm not going to test you on this until we get to pathology. I just like to show you that everything we do on the science side goes together. There is a purpose. Although I will admit, I did agree with you on the endocrine system, where we were like, why do we have to do this? But everything is important in its own way. Pulmonary circulation, we talked about last week. That's the system of blood vessels that carry the blood from the right ventricle of the heart to the lungs and back to the left atrium. So this week, we're talking about systemic circulation. And that's the system of vessels that carry the blood from the left ventricle of the heart to the tissues of the body and back to the right atrium. The left ventricle pumps the blood into the aorta, and the aorta flows to all parts of the body. Because remember in that little video that we watched, we saw how the aorta goes up, it branches to hit the top part of the body, and then the aorta bends and goes behind as the descending aorta to go to the trunk. And it goes all the way down to about the 5th lumbar, and then it branches into the common iliacs that go to the legs. Let's talk about the aorta first. So all arteries of systemic circulation are derived from the aorta. The aorta is divided into 3 general parts. So the ascending aorta originates from the left ventricle. So it goes through the aortic valve, goes into the aorta, and then it branches into the right and left coronary arteries that supply blood to the cardiac muscle. The aortic arch arches posteriorly, so behind and to the left, and it has 3 major branches: the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian artery. The third part is the descending aorta, which is the longest part that bends and extends. It goes through the diaphragm, through the abdomen, and divides to the right and left common iliac arteries. So you have the arch of the aorta. Brachiocephalic branches into the right common carotid and the right subclavian. The left common carotid is an actual branch off the aorta, and you also have the left subclavian artery. So know the 3 branches that leave the arch of the aorta. So if you ever have a car crash case, when there's a lot of pressure that hits the chest, because in a car crash, there can be an aorta rupture that's immediately fatal. So do y'all know what an aneurysm is? Did we talk about that? We'll talk about it more in pathology, but aneurysm is a bulge on a blood vessel. And if it ruptures, you can have like major internal blood loss, and a lot of people die immediately from aneurysms. So an aortic aneurysm, there's got to be like major trauma to it for that to happen. And once an aneurysm forms somewhere in the body, especially the aorta, it's going to enlarge and eventually rupture. Okay, So arteries at the head and neck, there's a ton of them. Don't be overwhelmed because you will get it. You have to see them over and over and over again. Okay. So the first vessel to branch from the aortic arch is the brachiocephalic artery. That's going to the right side. At the clavicle, the brachiocephalic artery branches to form the right common carotid, which takes blood to the right side of the head. And it also branches into the right subclavian as it goes under the clavicle, which takes blood to the right arm, the upper limb. Okay, so that's the first branch off the aorta. The second branch off the aorta is the left common carotid, which takes blood to the left side of the head. A lot of times, if somebody has an aneurysm, like in their head, when you're embalming, the embalming fluid will just go to one side because it's been ruptured, and so the other side's not going to receive it because these vessels take it straight halfway. We have something in our bodies called anastomosis, not occasionally, but like the lips. So the lips, if the preservative goes through, it won't do half and half. It'll go all the way through. But with the actual head, the blood vessels, if there's a rupture, it'll only reach one half of the face. Okay, sorry for my tangent. So we had the second vessel, which is the common carotid to the left side of the face. The right side of the face has the right common carotid. Right subclavian goes under the clavicle to the arm. The third vessel off the aorta is the left subclavian, which goes to the left arm. The subclavian meaning under the clavicle, go into the arms. As the common carotids reach the angle of the mandible, going all the way up to here, they branch into internal and external carotid arteries. Y'all following so far?
So far.
So the common carotids branch into internal and external when they reach the angle of the mandible. So the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries, which are branching off of the brachiocephalic, going up through the vertebrae, they are going to carry blood to the brain. The vertebral arteries, yeah, here we go. Okay, they're originating from the left and right subclavian, not brachiocephalic. It's the same vessel. So vertebral arteries, meaning it's going up through the vertebrae, and the internal carotid is the carotid that's splitting. They're going to carry blood to the brain. The vertebral arteries will then join to form the basilar artery, which also supplies the brain. Branches of the internal carotid and the basilar artery will also supply blood to the brain and complete a circle of arteries around the pituitary gland called the cerebral arterial circle, also called the circle of Willis. You will see this in autopsy cases when they remove the brain. There will be a circle at the base of the brain of arteries. You'll have to clamp them all during autopsy cases. And so this is a picture of an actual brain. You can see it better if you look at it on a computer screen. But there's these little vessels, and you can see it. And that's they'll form a circle. So the cerebral arterial circle, made up of branches of the internal carotid and the vertebral artery. Okay, so we're going to talk some more about the external, internal carotids, the vertebral arteries, and the basilar arteries. Okay, so basically you just have to understand the language. I'm just going to make this really simple. Just know the language. External carotid branches. If I say superior thyroid, where do you think that's going?
Yeah.
The thyroid. Lingual, under the tongue. Facial, to the face. Occipital,
Okay.
posterior auricular, behind the ear. Ascending pharyngeal, that's your throat. No, wait. That's your like nose. So that's going to the nose. Superficial temporal, these, and maxillary, upper mouth. So if you just can understand that language, you know exactly where they are. The internal carotid, so external carotid, they're going superficial. They're going to the face, to the tongue, to the maxillary. They're going anterior. Internal is going to the back. It's going to meet up with the vertebral arteries going up from the spine, and it's going to go to the back of the brain. So posterior communicating, anterior cerebral, and middle cerebral. So they're going to the brain. So just know that. External to the face, internal, and the brain, the back. Vertebral arteries, they come from the subclavian arteries, and they actually go into the vertebrae and come up the back. So you have anterior spinal, spine, posterior, inferior, cerebellum. Where's the cerebellum? The back of the brain. The vascular arteries, which is what these combine to form, cerebellar, cerebellar, cerebral. So if you just know the language, you know exactly where it's going to be. Here's mine. Okay. And I've got lots of pictures. If y'all want a color sheet, I'll get you a color sheet. Okay. The ones I'm gonna mostly, the ones you're gonna need to know, common carotids for embalming, axillaries in the arms, subclavians, get to the legs, femoral, popliteal, tibial, and dorsal. It's going to be so simple. I'm just got to I've got to expose you to this in case you see it, so you can recognize that language. Okay, so that's the head and neck. I will cover it some more because I know it's complicated. Arteries of the upper limb are so easy. So you have the subclavian, which goes underneath the clavicle. As it passes through about the armpit area, that's the axillary space. It turns into the axillary. You can use the axillary arteries to embalm the arms. You can't use them to embalm the whole body because they're small and you can't build up enough pressure for it to distribute around the body. You'd have to have lots of pressure. But you can embalm the arms with the axillary. The brachial artery is in the actual arm. And then it splits at the antecubital space, which is the arm, the elbow pit, I guess, for lack of a better word. The antecubital space splits into the radial and the ulnar. Remember, radial is on the thumb side, ulna is on the pinky side. From there, it goes into the palmar arches, the palm of the hand. And then it goes into the fingers with the digit arteries. So that's arteries of the upper limb. I have heard an acronym for those, but it's not appropriate for class. But you can find it if you look on the internet, look for acronyms to learn it. So this is from your book for if you want to study it at home and you want to look at the PowerPoint instead of trying to find it in the book. Arteries of the upper limb and the tissue they supply. So you've got the subclavian, which originates from the brachiocephalic artery, which is the first branch off the aorta. And then the left subclavian is a branch off of the aorta. So those turn into the vertebral, the internal thoracic, meaning they're going to go to the thoracic area, the chest area, and the thyrocervical trunk. But the subclavian artery turns into axillary. Don't worry about those because I will never ask you those. Just know the axillary arteries, the brachial arteries, which are a continuation of the axillary. You have the deep brachial, and then it splits into the radial and the ulnar. That's it. That's all you need. Thoracic artery and its branches, you mainly just need to know for comprehension because we will not use these to embalm. So there's no real purpose to know it other than to just understand how blood flow goes through the body. So as the aorta branches, it'll turn and it'll go through the thoracic cage. The thoracic cage is our rib cage. So it has visceral branches off of the thoracic aorta that reaches visceral organs, which are your lungs, the esophagus, and the pericardium. It has parietal branches that will supply the thoracic cavity wall. So, and then you'll also see, if you see phrenic artery, that means it supplies the diaphragm. So know that phrenic means diaphragm. And if you ever see intercostals, that means in between the ribs. So just to be familiar with that language, because these are so tiny, we will never use them. But the visceral branches of the thoracic aorta, if you see bronchial, you'll know after we study the respiratory system, that is the lung tissue. The esophageal, you know, that's the esophagus. If you see intercostal, you know, that's the ribs. And if you see phrenic, that's the diaphragm. Now, the abdominal aorta, you won't even know these words. You'll need to know what they mean. Okay? So the abdominal aorta is descending aorta. So it's going to reach all of the visceral organs in the abdomen. Okay? So there's unpaired and there's paired. And you'll see how they're paired. You'll see what that means. Paired just means two, like kidneys or testes. So visceral branches, you have the left gastric, which will supply the stomach and esophagus. So gastric, stomach. If you see gastroduodenal, stomach and the duodenum, the small intestine. The right gastric is the stomach, hepatic is liver, splenic, the spleen, the gastroepiploic, never seen that on board. But if you see gastro, you know that's stomach. Mesenteric always means intestines. And then suprarenal are your adrenal glands. Renal would be your kidneys. Gonadal, I just feel like I don't like the way that word sounds. So you have testicular, will obviously go to the testes, and then the ovarian, which will go to the ovaries, ureter, the uterine, the uterine tube, sorry. Okay. And then the inferior phrenic, which means the bottom of the diaphragm, median sacral, that's the inferior vertebrae, one of the last ones. And then it splits into the common iliac. So the iliacs is what we're really important. But this is just to give an example of visuals, and you'll need to know what those root words mean, such as hepatic, splenic, duodenal. You just, as long as you know those words, you know exactly what they're supplying. You'll never have to go in and find these small arteries because we can't use them to embalm. But just so you know the language. Any questions so far? This is where it becomes, no, not this part. After this part, it'll get important. Okay, so arteries of the pelvis, they start at the level of the fifth lumbar vertebra, and the abdominal aorta, can't pronounce things, divides into the two common iliac arteries. They're literally right here. If you ever have an obese case, you can pull these up. They're very superior, and you can use that to embalm the legs. So the common iliacs further split into the internal and the external iliac. So internal, meaning it's going further into the body, it's going to reach the pelvis and the organs of the pelvis, so your reproductive organs. The parietal branches will supply the walls and floor of the pelvis. So if you see lumbar, gluteal, proximal thigh muscles, and external genitalia, that's around the area of the pelvis. So it's blood flow through the pelvis. So the iliac arteries give blood to the organs of the reproductive system of the body. Now, when you have an autopsy case and they remove all of the organs in the body, all of these vessels will be cut. They'll be severed. So you'll have to look and pull them up and tie them off. And you won't even see the iliac arteries because they'll basically have just been severed and cut out. But you'll have problems reaching the actual, which I don't know why anyone would want to do this, but some embalmers will say that you can't reach the gluteal muscles with the arterial fluid. But my question would be, who's going to view the butt of someone? You know, so it really doesn't matter. So these are important because we actually do use these arteries of the lower limb. So most importantly, I want you to know the branches of the aorta, the arteries of the upper limbs, and the arteries of the lower limbs. So the abdominal aorta splits into the common iliacs. The iliacs turn into the femoral, which is where we have our femoral triangle, because we use the femoral artery to embalm lead. You can use the femoral artery to embalm the entire body. It's that big. So the femoral artery then goes to the knee region, where it turns into the popliteal artery. It's behind the knee, which further splits into the anterior, the front of the tibia, and posterior tibia. So it splits. It goes to the front of the leg and to the back of the leg. The front part, the anterior tibial artery, then becomes the dorsalis pedis tibial arteries. The dorsalis pedis artery, at the foot. So the front, the anterior tibial artery turns into the dorsalis pedis, where it supplies to the top part of the foot. Now the posterior tibial artery, it also has another branch called the fibular artery or the perineal artery. We don't use that for embalming though, because it just stops. It's just supplying part of that leg and those calf muscles. And then it turns into the medial and lateral plantar. So the sole of the foot. And that's how blood flow gets to the sole of the foot. And then it branches to the digital branches, digits, meaning fingers and toes. Good so far?
We had they come from Ohio last week, and when we got the body, we looked at the embalming or whatever, and we looked at the neck, we looked at the leg. Where'd they embalm? They went between the big toe and the first right between
What?
on the feet and embalmed the body that way.
That is so crazy.
And it was a female, you know.
Yep.
So they're trying to, you know, just catch.
Axillary arteries too.
They went through the big toe and the second toe there, right underneath.
Wow. Well, I mean, if they can raise that hustle, all power to them. I'm not searching for that.
Pretty good, but.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah,
Can't find an incision site like.
Yeah, I'm like, where'd they go? And then I looked.
Wow.
Yeah, I looked at the foot, I said, what's that sticking out? They had trocar in there instead of screwing it. The two trocar buttons.
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Now the axillary, you can do that. Now the book says not to because of the high pressures you would have to use, but every time I had an autopsy case, I would use axillaries, but I would only use them to embalm the arms. But you're right. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of embalmers think the axillary is right here. It's in the armpit. That's that axillary space. That's really interesting too. I could see that. I could see that more than the toes. That is so strange.
It was hard.
I bet
It
it was.
went just right through the toe in that second toe there.
Interesting. I mean, that the non-viewable incision place. I can get that. Okay. It's 9, so I'm gonna stop the recording and we'll take a break. That way the recording won't overwhelm you. Maybe. Okay.